We may be headed for continued slowdown in global growth, but no hard landing is expected, according to the U.S. Conference Board, which measures a number of economic indicators. Ataman Ozyildirium from the Conference Board joins us here on Arise Exchange to kind of walk us through this report a little bit. When you talk about the global economy, right now it does largely come down to China, doesn't it? Because China is such a big gravitational field.
Yeah, China is a big part of the global economic picture. And the slowdown in China has started, in our view, a couple of years ago, in 2012. And we have accounted for these new numbers in our global economic outlook for the first time this year. While we don't see a hard landing, the global economic outlook for the next 5 years to a decade is pretty subdued.
You're looking at about 2.8% GDP growth. And how does that compare to the IMF growth forecasts?
Our numbers are generally a little bit lower on the range across, whether you look at IMF or other agencies. A lot of the reason why we are a little bit on the lower end is because we're looking at the overall supply picture for the world, and the contributions from labor force growth is just not there with aging populations, and we don't see the investment picking up the slack, and productivity has also been on a falling trend. So all of these factors come together and give us a pretty slow global growth picture.
Now, when you look at China, because it is so heavily involved in some of the emerging markets throughout the African continent, for example, if you're having China slow down, you are going to see some of the African nations slow down as well, including some of the biggest economies there, Nigeria, South Africa.
China's slowdown has really affected a lot of the exporters of raw materials, commodities, and the African nations have been affected by this, as well as Latin America. But it looks like a lot of the African economies, surprisingly perhaps, have weathered the storm much better than some of the Latin American economies.
Is that because of a push towards technology investments in Africa? So you see Kenya, you see Nigeria, you see Rwanda heavily involved in technology and maybe becoming sort of more self-sufficient in growing their economies?
They've managed to build more balanced economies, including the technology investments. And in a way, they've been more prepared for a downturn in commodity prices.
Yeah, and we're still looking at very difficult times for Latin America, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Of course, the picture is very mixed, whether you look at the Pacific coast or the Atlantic coast. But a lot of the commodity exporters, Brazil, Venezuela, are having a very difficult time. Those countries like Chile and Mexico that have reformed their economies and built a more sound, more diverse economy are doing better, not surprisingly.
When you look at the GDP, the United States is still the best-looking house in not a great neighborhood right now. The question is, how long can the U.S. hold on without being pulled down by Europe?
The question is
because
whether...
you're forecasting your growth at just 1.6%.
Right, which is actually a fairly optimistic forecast for Europe. We're on a little bit more positive side. But as you said, the U.S. economy has been the best among its peers of mature economies. The big question is whether the U.S. will be able to drive the rest of the global economy out of the doldrums. And we are looking at about 2.4, 2.5% growth on average over the next several quarters. And the U.S. is doing very well based on the strength of the U.S. consumer, of course, which is 70% of the economy.
Yeah.
As well as getting a little bit help from the housing sector.
And well, finally, I do want to ask you then, the flip side, the emerging markets. Are we going to be able to start seeing a turnaround in the emerging markets?
We are looking at a modest improvement for emerging markets, and that's partly because they've been slowing down. Now there's more room for them to grow. And the improvement in Europe and in the U.S. is going to help with emerging markets exports and, again, help them along.
Okay. Ataman, thank you so much.
Good to be here.
All right, we'll have you back on later in the year to see how the GDP numbers work out. Appreciate it. Coming up on Arise Exchange, the Israeli Prime Minister and President Obama meet to work out their differences. Stay with us.